Welcome to Harper McLeod's Marine Economy Week, and today it's time to hear about offshore renewables. I'm Omar Ali, I head up the renewable energy team at Harper McLeod, and I'm delighted to be joined by William Black, Director of REAMP, Renewable Energy Consultancy. In the year in review session, I mentioned about Labour's energy policy, and it seems the most appropriate place to start. So William, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Omar.
No problem at all. The Labour government have promised to make Britain a renewable energy superpower and to quadruple offshore wind by 2030. What are the key issues that offshore wind developers are facing in being able to deliver projects to these timescales?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Omar. I think it is a challenge, there's no doubt about it. And for me, there's two angles to this challenge. There's the policy context, and then we've got the actual projects that are about to try and flow through the consenting framework. So let's pick up on each of them individually. In terms of the policy context, we've got a national marine plan that dates back to 2015. And the world has changed substantially since then, both in the government's aspirations for clean power by 2030, but let's not forget the overarching 2048 net zero targets here in Scotland. So that National Marine Plan is now somewhat out of date. We've also got the Sector Marine Plan that come out, and it for offshore wind energy, it was specifically looking at how do we deliver what was the Scotland programme and the INTOG programme. And almost immediately it became out of date as soon as the projects were awarded. So what we're looking at now is a programme whereby we're going to see the National Marine Plan 2 be refreshed, and we're waiting to hear when that will finally land. It started in 2022, so some time's passed. So we're looking to see how that will come out. And then we've got the sector marine plans as well. So picking up on the fact that Scotland is no longer the 11 gigawatts that it was initially thought. It's now creeping towards 30, if you include the INTOG programmes on that. So that needs to be taken into account. The final policy context here that's important is the strategic compensation. And the UK government have approached that by trying to come forward with a set of measures that doesn't look at projects individually, but takes them as a collective to try and solve that colossal problem of how much megawatts we're trying to put on the grid from this offshore sector. So it's looking at strategic compensation measures, potentially funds that could be used by developers and determining authorities to enable these projects to go forward. It's looking at standards and monitoring as well as to how that could fold out. So there's a number of components playing out in that policy arm that are going to be essential to deliver that. And we've heard from the Scottish Government earlier in the year that said that some of those plans will emerge towards the end of this year. But I think for the compensation piece, we're probably into 2025 for that. So let's turn to planning and the projects that are in the planning system, because there's currently, as we stand, 19 projects that have been given a lease under ScotWind, 2 of which are in planning. And on INTOG, we've got 5 innovation projects, and we've got 7 on that oil and gas side, that technological oil and gas side. And again, we've seen through that INTOG programme, a project that's already been given consent, which is fantastic, and it's now achieved a CFD. But again, we've got a tsunami of projects to come forward. And is the marine licensing team truly set up to deal with what could be almost 29 projects coming through the system quickly to deliver to 2030 and just beyond? So yeah, a real challenge there, both in the policy framework, but also the delivery of all those projects at the same time.
Projects like Greenvolt's 560 megawatt floating offshore wind project, which is the first consented Crown Estate Scotland INTOG leasing project, will add a significant amount of renewable energy to the grid. But how will the grid be impacted when, as you've said, there's potentially 20 to 30 projects which could be operational in Scotland in the next 10 years?
Yes, the grid is a kind of key component of this deliverable, isn't it? And so I think thinking about grid, a fair comment would be that we've not progressed it strategically quickly enough as the projects and the generators have themselves. And what I mean by that is, for some time we've had a number of onshore developments coming forward, and now we've got this massive programme of offshore wind in front of us that we're going to deliver through ScotWind and Intog, of which the Greenvolt is the first project to come through at 560 megawatts. So what we're now doing is trying to play catch up to put in place the strategic plans for the grid to deliver a framework whereby the power can be taken from these generators and no longer just brought onshore at the closest point, but potentially going further afield and into interconnectors. So there's a lot of work to be done to achieve that before you even get to the point of construction. So let's go through a little bit about what's happened in the grid recently, and then actually the changes that are still happening as of the last couple of weeks and will continue to accelerate into 25 and the run up to 2030. So if we hark back to the holistic network design, it feels like it was a decade ago, was actually only 2022. And in those times, we were thinking that ScotWind would deliver about 11 gigawatts, as I mentioned earlier. However, the reality is we've actually got about 30 gigawatts. And so HND, Holistic Network Design 1, if you want to call it that, was immediately surpassed almost as soon as it was brought to the plan. And we then had the ESO and the government saying, actually, we need to go back to the drawing board and start again because of the 30 gigawatts that we're now speaking of. We thought we were dealing with 11 and now we've got 30. So they did that, and they went back to the drawing board with what's commonly referred to in the industry as the Holistic Network Design follow-up exercise. But what that culminated in was a document that looked at beyond 2030. What were the connections going to look like in the run-up to 2030? And we'd seen that in HND1, but beyond that, and how do we go about connecting all of these 29 projects in Scotland and beyond, because there's projects in England and Wales as well, of course. So we have seen some movement there, but some of the components of that are, we've got HND2 showing us a further 21 gigawatts to design for, and on top of that, we've got electricity use increasing by 63% is what the predictions are. So you've got this demand consumption going up at the same time as the generators are being installed. So that's a complex picture, and it requires some £58 billion, if you believe the 2030 document, to fix it. So that is a complexity that's there in grid. We've also got the Centralised Strategic Network Plan that in many ways is a follow-on to the 2030 plan or beyond. And it's not due to 2026. So again, it showcases the fact that this planning and strategic development is still ongoing. It's not finished. And they're still formulating the plans to develop it to achieve the export of the power that we need to do from these generators. I can't go on without mentioning the NESO because it's big news in that National Grid has sold the ESO and various other elements to the UK government or taxpayer. And as such, the NESO, which went live on the 1st of October, so only a couple of weeks ago, and is already starting to engage with stakeholders, as you would expect of a new organisation. But I very much see an acceleration of that engagement under the NESO. We're starting to see webinars and workshops, of which I've just come from one today, at a pace that I don't think we've seen in recent times. That's also got an integration with the mission control that Chris Stark's going to head up. And that mission control is really focused on how do we achieve the clean power for 2030 that the UK government's trying to achieve, and the Labour government's kind of set out as a clear manifesto commitment. The final thing I would say is that the mission control is asking NESO, how do we get there? How do we get to 2030? And what we've seen in response of that is we've got all of that overarching policy documentation that I was speaking of. But what they are now setting out is we're going to give clear advice in the autumn towards the winter of this government to say, this is how you get there, and these are the ways that it can be achieved. And I suspect that's going to look like similar to what we've had in the past with the future energy scenarios. We'll probably get two scenarios that play out that show a pathway for the government to try and follow and achieve that 2030 clean power.
It's clear that ScotWind had a quality supply chain at its heart. How is that going to be implemented?
Yes. I think what we can say about the ScotWind process is that it's widely recognised now that a quality-based approach to the supply chain and what the bid overall looks like is way more favourable than just kind of highest bidder. And we've seen that, and that's been widely praised by many third parties as to the way that the Scottish Government ran that process. Turning back to what does that mean? Because we spoke earlier about the pressure that comes into the planning system, both from the policy context and also the consenting framework. But what we now see is that pressure is quickly going to shift to the delivery of these ScotWind and Intog projects. And as such, that pressure will build on the supply chain. So for me, there's three components to this that kind of need a little bit of investigation. The first component is clearly around skills. Do we have the skills to do this? And I don't think it's any coincidence that we see the likes of GB Energy being located in Aberdeen. I think that's a really sensible move because it's going to anchor itself right in the heart of a community that's got a skill set that serves the oil and gas sector today. And as part of that energy transition piece, I think that will really accelerate that, taking skills that are there in these large multinational businesses and redeploying them into wind. So I think that's got merit and absolutely should be the focal point for that. Thinking about the mechanisms for delivery are important as well, because a key fact to that is it's all very well having the skill set there and locally, but you need the components to deliver that. And what I mean by that is these green free ports are essential to that. We need these green free ports to have the ability to attract inward investment and bring technology and skills externally to Scotland and the UK and bring it to Scotland to deploy on the ScotWind projects if we're going to realise the potential that could bring. But the final component, and it's really started to take centre stage under the Labour government now, is community wealth building. And for some time, community wealth building has been there and has been thread through a number of policy documents and economic frameworks that have been produced both by the UK government and by the Scottish government. And a good example of that is actually the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which was back in 2022, where it recognised this need for skills, jobs and communities to be involved as part of that process. I think we've more recently seen the focus of that specifically around the energy sector through the Green Industrial Strategy that was released a couple of months ago by the Scottish Government. And again, it picks up on wind, hydrogen, CCUS, and clean energy intensive industries, which are essential if we're going to tackle this problem. So turning specifically to more kind of what community wealth building could achieve, it's thinking about how do we retain more wealth in the community? How do the community get a benefit from these projects being located next to them so that they can see part of that transition and be involved in it and not just have it kind of done at a distance or miss the opportunity. So it's no coincidence the Scottish Government have got the programme for government out this year again, and community wealth building is a firm commitment and has been for a number of years now. It's played into the Just Transition plans that we're seeing, and we're expecting the energy strategy refresh imminently from the Scottish Government that will include, for the first time, that Just Transition plan as part of energy. So it's really a kind of focal point for the Scottish Government and nationally now through the UK Government as well. The final concept I'd talk about is, this is a kind of national context, but more locally, I think examples of community wealth building we're seeing perhaps played out by local authorities for the first time. And the Highland Council Social Value Charter is a great example of that, whereby they've come forward with a strategy of how do we take this from the kind of very small funds that are large in size, millions of pounds, but quite often centred on a handful of communities. How do we take that and kind of broaden that out so that we get a much bigger economic benefit from it than just the kind of small isolated communities that have the developments in close proximity. So I think you're going to see much more of that going forward. And it'll be interesting to see how that social value charter, which has now come into force in the Highland Council, is implemented there and then potentially replicated wider. I think that's something that's still to come, and I look forward to seeing how that is implemented.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much, William, for that. It's going to be a very exciting 4 or 5 years ahead, and we'll see what comes of all the ScotWind projects and INTOG leasing projects as well. So thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
Thank you. Well, thanks for joining us, and we hope you got something from that conversation. Just a reminder that tomorrow rounds off our Marine Economy Week, where Ashley Fleming, who heads up Harper McLeod's immigration practice, will be chatting to Claire Mack, who is the Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. Claire and Ashley will be talking about people, skills, the latest immigration policy when it comes to skilled worker visas. That is a live webinar which you will have the opportunity to put your questions to Ashley and Claire. You can register for the webinar on our website. Thank you.